The Looming Tower, Chapter 5, The Miracles. 1 month after the Soviet invasion, Prince Turki al-Faisal paid a visit to Pakistan. He was shaken by the Soviet takeover of Afghanistan, which he saw as the first step in a march toward the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Pakistan would be next. He believed the Soviet Union's ultimate target was to control the Strait of Hormuz at the base of the Gulf, where Oman reaches toward Iran like a fishhook for an open mouth. From there, the Soviets could control the supply route for the supertankers that ferried the petroleum from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and Iran. Whomever commanded the strait had a knife at the throat of the world's oil supply. Turkey's colleagues in the Pakistani Inter Services Intelligence briefed him on the Afghan resistance, then took him to the refugee camps outside Peshawar. Turkey was appalled by the scale of the suffering. He went back to the kingdom vowing to dedicate more money to the Mujahideen, although he believed that these ragged soldiers could never defeat the Red Army. Afghanistan was gone, he decided. He only hoped to delay the inevitable Soviet invasion of Pakistan. Similar thinking was going on in Washington, especially by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the U.S. National Security Advisor for the Carter administration. Brzezinski, however, saw the invasion as an opportunity. He wrote to Carter immediately saying, "Now we can give the USSR its own Vietnam War." Looking for an ally in this endeavor, the Americans naturally turned to the Saudis, that is, to Turkey, the American-educated prince who held the Afghan account. Turkey became the key man in the covert alliance of the United States and the Saudis to funnel money and arms to the resistance through the Pakistani ISI. It was vital to keep this program secret in order to prevent the Soviets from having the excuse they sought to invade Pakistan. Until the end of the war, the Saudis would match the Americans dollar for dollar, starting with only $75,000, but growing into billions. The immediate problem Turkey faced was that the Mujahideen were little more than disorganized mobs. There were about 170 armed Afghan militias in the mid-1980s. In order to manage this chaos, the ISI anointed 6 major émigré parties as the designated recipients for aid. Afghan refugees, who numbered 3.27 million by 1988, had to sign up with one of the 6 official parties to qualify for food and supplies. The 2 largest of these, headed by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Burhanuddin Rabbani, each had 800,000 people in Peshawar under their authority. Turkey forcibly created a 7th official party that would better represent Saudi interests. Ittihad al-Islami, Islamic Union, was privately funded through bin Laden and others and headed by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. An imposing and dashing Afghan warlord, 6 feet 3 inches tall, who draped himself in colorful blankets. Sayyaf spoke excellent classical Arabic from his years studying at Al-Azhar University in Cairo. His devout Wahhabi beliefs were out of step with the Sufi traditions that predominated in Afghanistan before the war, but they were very much attuned to the interests of the Saudi Arabian government and its religious establishment. These 7 Mujahideen leaders came to be known by the CIA and other intelligence agencies that were the principal means of support as the 7 dwarves. Turkey saw trouble ahead with the greedy and contentious dwarves, and he repeatedly urged these competing groups to unify under a single command. In 1980, he brought the Mujahideen leaders to Mecca. Ahmed Badib, Turkey's assistant, escorted them. Badib discovered that the most expedient way of silencing the discord among the resistance leaders was to lock them up in a jail in Taif until they agreed to pick Sayyaf, Turkey's man, as their leader. But as soon as they left the kingdom, the jailhouse agreement fell apart. They went back to their old ways, Turkey complained. Fear of bodily participation kept bin Laden well away from the battlefield in the early years of the war, a fact that later caused him great shame. He limited his trips in Pakistan to Lahore and Islamabad, not even venturing as far as Peshawar, then shuttling back home to Jeddah. These frequent excursions eventually cost him his job. By walking away from the Saudi bin Laden group's reconstruction of the Prophet's mosque in Medina, he forfeited his share of the profit, an amount that Abdullah Azam calculated was 8 million riyals, about $2.5 million. In 1984, Azam persuaded him to cross the frontier into Jaji, where Sayyaf had a camp high in the mountains above a major Soviet outpost. I was surprised by the sad state of the equipment and everything else, weapons, roads, and trenches, bin Laden recalled. I asked for forgiveness from God Almighty, feeling that I had sinned because I listened to those who advised me not to go. I felt that this 4-year delay could not be pardoned unless I became a martyr. At 7 in the morning on June 26, 1984, during the month of Ramadan, most of the Mujahideen in the Jaji camp were still sleeping since they had been praying and eating late into the night after fasting during the day. The sound of a Soviet jet rudely brought them back to consciousness. The men dove for their shallow trenches. The mountains were shaking from the bombardment, bin Laden noted. He was shocked by how low the planes flew as they attacked. The missiles that landed outside the camp were making a huge noise that covered the sound of the Mujahideen cannon, as if they did not exist. Bear in mind that if you heard these sounds alone, you might say that there could not be anything louder. As to the missiles that landed inside the camp, thanks to God, they did not explode. They landed as iron lumps on the land. I felt closer to God than ever. Bin Laden recorded that the Mujahideen shot down 4 Soviet aircraft that morning. I saw with my own eyes the remains of one of the pilots, he marveled. 3 fingers, a part of the nerve, the skin of one cheek, an ear, the neck, and the skin of the back. Some Afghan brothers came and took a photo of him as if he were a slaughtered sheep. We cheered. He also noted admiringly that the Afghans had not bothered to jump into the trenches with the frightened Arabs when the attack began. Not one of our brothers had been injured, thank God. This battle gave me, in fact, a big push to continue in this matter. I become more convinced of the fact that no one could be injured except by God's will. Bin Laden immediately returned to Saudi Arabia, and before the end of Ramadan, he raised a fortune for the Mujahideen, between $5 and $10 million, Abdullah Azam airily recalled. I don't remember for sure. More than $2 million of that came from one of bin Laden's half-sisters. Until now, bin Laden had been mainly as a promising acolyte. Until now, bin Laden had been seen mainly as a promising acolyte of Sheikh Abdullah's. But suddenly he eclipsed his mentor as the chief private financier of the jihad. Azam reacted by officially joining forces with his protege. In September 1984, during the Hajj, the 2 men met in Mecca. Although he was quiet and deferential, bin Laden already had his own plan. Perhaps it had been born in the attack, or in that attack in Jaji, when the Arabs all dove for the trenches. He had observed that the Afghans treated them as glorified guests, not as real mujahideen. He suggested to Azam that we should take on the responsibility of the Arabs because we know them better and can provide more rigorous training for them. The 2 men agreed to create a more formal role for the Arabs in Afghanistan, although there were few Arabs actually fighting the jihad at that time. Bin Laden undertook to change that by offering a ticket, a residence, and living expenses for every Arab and his family who joined the forces. That amounted to about $300 per month for each household. Azam added to bin Laden's stunning announcement by issuing a fatwa that electrified Islamists everywhere. In a book eventually published under the title Defense of Muslim Lands, Azam argued that Jihad in Afghanistan was obligatory for every able-bodied Muslim. He had given an advance copy of the text to Sheikh Abdulaziz bin Baz, Saudi Arabia's chief cleric, who wrote a preface to the book and pronounced his own supporting fatwa in the bin Laden family mosque in Jeddah. Azam's fatwa draws a distinction between a fard ayn and a fard kifaya. The first is an individual religious obligation that falls upon all Muslims, like praying and fasting. One cannot avoid such duties and be considered a good Muslim. If non-believers invade a Muslim land, it is fard ayn, a compulsory duty for the local Muslims to expel them. If they fail, then the obligation expands to their Muslim neighbors. If they too slacken, or there is again a shortage of manpower, then it is upon the people behind them and upon the people behind them to march forward. This process continues until it becomes fard ayn upon the whole world. A child does not need permission from his parents, nor a debtor from his creditor, nor even a woman from her husband to join the jihad against the invader. Fard kifaya, on the other hand, is a duty of the community. Azam gives the example of a group of people walking along a beach. They see a child about to drown. The child, he suggests, is Afghanistan. Saving the drowning child is an obligation for all the swimmers who witness him. If someone moves to save him, the sin falls from the rest. But if no one moves, all the swimmers are in sin. Thus, Azam argues that jihad against the Soviets is the duty of each Muslim individually, as well as the entire Muslim people, and that all are in sin until the invader is repelled. Bolstered by the imprimatur of bin Baz and other distinguished clerics, news of the fatwa circulated immediately through Islamic communities everywhere. Although it's true that the Arab Afghan movement began with these two events, bin Laden's announcement of financial support for Arab Mujahideen and Azam's searing fatwa, one would have to say that their initial efforts were largely a failure. Rather few Arabs actually obeyed the summons, and many who did were drawn as much by bin Laden's money as by the obligation to defend Islam in the manner that Azam prescribed. As soon as they returned to Pakistan, bin Laden and Sheikh Abdullah Azam set up what they called the Services Bureau, Maktab al-Khadmat, in a house bin Laden was renting in the University Town section of Peshawar. Bin Laden provided $25,000 a month to keep the office running. The house also served as a hostel for Arab Mujahideen and the headquarters of Azam's magazine and book publishing efforts. The Services Bureau was essentially a repository for the money that the two men were sweeping in through their intensive fundraising efforts. Jamal Khalifa joined bin Laden and Azam in the Services Bureau, and they struggled to ensure that the donations, which often came in suitcases full of cash, actually got into the hands of the refugees. Azam's long-standing membership in the Muslim Brothers gave him an international circuit to call upon for his ceaseless promotion of the insurgency. Still, his efforts did not compare with those of bin Laden, whom he called this heaven-sent man, with a direct connection to the Saudi royal family and the petro-billionaires of the Gulf. Bin Laden also drew from his connection to Prince Turki. Twice a month, Turkey's chief of staff and bin Laden's former science teacher, Ahmed Badib, traveled to Peshawar to deliver cash to the Mujahideen leaders. The Saudi government contributed $350 to $500 million per year for the Afghan jihad. This money was placed in a Swiss bank account controlled by the United States government, which used it to support the Mujahideen, but the Saudis also ran their own programs privately, raising millions of dollars for their favored commanders. More than a tenth of the private money went to supplement bin Laden's unofficial activities. Turki says he first met bin Laden in 1985 or 1986 in Peshawar. They met again soon afterward at a Saudi embassy party in Islamabad. Bin Laden would dutifully report his activities to Turki, such as bringing in heavy equipment and engineers to build fortifications. He struck the prince as shy, soft-spoken, friendly, almost gentle, and highly useful. Through bin Laden, Turki could recruit young Arabs to the jihad, as well as provide training and indoctrination outside ISI control. Moreover, bin Laden was raising large sums of money off the books, a trove that a skillful intelligence operator could put to use. The Services Bureau became a registry for young Arabs who turned up in Peshawar looking for a way to get into the war. It offered these men, or often enough high school students, guest houses to stay in and directed them to the training camps. In a place where magical legends sprouted so easily, bin Laden soon became a part of jihadi lore. Many of the Arab Afghans swore fealty to Azam, but it was bin Laden who was paying their rent. His wealth and his charity immediately distinguished him. He passed through the hospital wards, a lanky, singular figure, handing out cashews and chocolate to the wounded fighters while carefully noting their names and addresses. He built a theological library for the edification of the mujahideen who were killing time in the city, and he tutored at least one young Afghan warrior in Arabic. He gave money to Saif to start the University of Dawah al-Jihad just outside Peshawar in the tribal areas, which will become internationally known as a terrorist training academy. He also pitched in at Jihad, the Arabic language magazine that Azam published. He was not politically sophisticated like some of the others in the Bureau, but he was tireless. An activist with great imagination, Abdullah Anis, an Algerian who worked with him in the Services Bureau, observed. He ate very little. He slept very little. Very generous. He'd give you his clothes. He'd give you his money. Bin Laden did not, however, make much of an impression as a charismatic leader, especially in the shadow of Abdullah Azam. He had a small smile on his face and soft hands. Hardened Pakistani Mujahid recalled. You'd think you were shaking hands with a girl. He was shy and serious, and he struck many as naive. When he laughed, he covered his mouth with his hand. A Syrian who eventually became a confidant of bin Laden remembered their first meeting. It was in November 1985. He had no name at the time. We were in a prayer hall in a guest house. People asked him to talk, so he talked about horses. He said if you love a horse, he will respond to you. That was in his mind. That's what was in his mind. Horses. Sheikh Abdullah called the small band of Arabs who gathered in Peshawar the Brigade of Strangers. The Arabs kept to themselves, establishing their own mosques and schools and newspapers. Some had arrived with nothing in their pockets but a telephone number. Thanks to bin Laden's generous subsidy, many of them settled in the suburb of Hayatabad, a neighborhood of two-story tract houses at the edge of the tribal areas, provided with all the modern conveniences, refrigerators, washing machines, dryers, and so on. Indeed, many of them lived more comfortably than bin Laden. Across the Khyber Pass was the war. The young Arabs who came to Peshawar prayed that their crossing would lead them to martyrdom in paradise. As they passed the time, they traded legends about themselves, about the call that had drawn young Muslims to free their brothers in Afghanistan. In fact, the war was being fought almost entirely by the Afghans themselves. Despite Azam's famous fatwa and bin Laden's subsidies, there were never more than 3,000 of these outsiders who came to be known as the Arab Afghans in the war against the Soviets, and most of them never got out of Peshawar. The Arab Afghans were often unwanted renegades in their own countries, and they found that the door closed behind them as soon as they left. Other young Muslims, prompted by their own governments to join the jihad, were stigmatized as fanatics when they did so. It would be difficult for many of them to ever return home. These abandoned idealists were naturally looking for a leader. They had little to cling to except their cause and each other. As stateless persons, they naturally revolted against the very idea of the state. They saw themselves as a borderless posse empowered by God to defend the entire Muslim people. That was exactly bin Laden's dream. In Peshawar, they adopted new identities. Few people in the Arab community used their actual names, and it was rude to ask. In this incognito underground, a child often did not know his father's real identity. It reflected the name of the Mujahid's firstborn male child or some quality that suited his personality. A common jihadi name was Abu Muhammad. A common jihadi name, such as Abu Muhammad, would be followed by his nationality, a Libi, for instance, the Libyan. It was a simple code, but difficult to decipher since one had to know a man's reputation or his family in order to catch the reference. It was death, not victory in Afghanistan, that summoned many young Arabs to Peshawar. Martyrdom was the product that Azam sold in the books, tracts, videos, and cassette tapes that circulated in mosques and Arab language bookstores. I traveled to acquaint people with jihad, Azam said, recalling his lectures in mosques and Islamic centers around the world. We were trying to satisfy the thirst for martyrdom. We are still in love with this. Azam visited the United States each year. Kansas City, St. Louis, Dallas, all over the heartland, and the major cities as well, looking for money and recruits among the young Muslims who were mesmerized by the myths he spun. He told stories of the Mujahideen who defeated vast columns of Soviet troops virtually single-handed. He claimed that some of the brave warriors who had been run over by tanks but survived, others were shot, but the bullets failed to penetrate. If death came, it was even more miraculous. When one beloved mujahid expired, the ambulance filled with the sound of humming bees and chirping birds, even though they were in the Afghan desert in the middle of the night. Bodies of martyrs uncovered after a year in the grave still smelled sweet, and their blood continued to flow. Heaven and nature conspired to repel the godless invader. Angels rode into the battle on horseback, and falling bombs were intercepted by birds, which raced ahead of the jets to form a protective canopy over the soldiers. The miracle stories naturally proliferated as word spread that Sheikh Abdullah was paying for mujahids who brought him the wonderful tales. The lure of an illustrious and meaningful death was especially powerful in cases where the pleasures and rewards of life were crushed by government oppression and economic deprivation. From Iraq to Morocco, Arab governments had stifled freedom and signally failed to create wealth at the very time when democracy and personal income were sharply climbing in virtually all other parts of the globe. Saudi Arabia, the richest of the lot, was such a notorious, unproductive country that the extraordinary abundance of petroleum had failed to generate any other significant source of income. Indeed, if one subtracted the oil revenue from the Gulf countries, 260 million Arabs exported less than the 5 million Finns. 260 million Arabs exported less than the 5 million Finns. Radicalism usually prospers in the gap between rising expectations and declining opportunities. This is especially true where the population is young, idle, and bored, where the art is impoverished, where entertainment, movies, theater, music is policed and absent or absent altogether, and where young men are set apart from the consoling and socializing presence of women. Adult illiteracy remained the norm in many Arab countries. Unemployment was among the highest in the developing world. Anger, resentment, and humiliation spurred young Arabs to search for dramatic remedies. Martyrdom promised such young men an ideal alternative to a life that was so sparing in its rewards. A glorious death beckoned to the sinner, who would be forgiven, it is said, with the first spurt of blood. and he would behold his place in paradise even before his death. 70 members of his household might be spared the fires of hell because of his sacrifice. The martyr who was poor will be crowned in heaven with a jewel more valuable than the earth itself. And for those young men who came from cultures where women are shuttered away and rendered unattainable for someone without prospects, martyrdom offered the conjugal pleasures of 72 virgins. The dark-eyed houris, as the Quran describes them, chaste as hidden pearls. They awaited the martyr with feasts of meat and fruit and cups of the purest wine. The pageant of martyrdom that Azam limned before his worldwide audience created the death cult that would one day form the core of Al-Qaeda. For the journalists covering the war, the Arab Afghans were a curious sideshow to the real fighting, set apart by their obsession with dying. When a fighter fell, his comrades would congratulate him and weep because they were not also slain in battle. These scenes struck other Muslims as bizarre. The Afghans were fighting for their country, not for paradise or an idealized Islamic community. For them, martyrdom was not such a high priority. Rahmallah Yousafzai, the Peshawar bureau chief for the news of Pakistan Daily, observed a camp of Arab Afghans that was under attack in Jalalabad. The Arabs had pitched white tents on the front lines, where they were easy marks for Soviet bombers. Why? The reporter asked incredulously. We want them to bomb us, the men told them. We want to die. They believed that they were answering God's call. If they were truly blessed, God would reward them with a martyr's death. I wish I could raid and be slain, and then raid and be slain, and then raid and be slain, bin Laden later declared, quoting the prophet. The Quran is full of references to jihad. Some of them have to do with the inner striving for perfection, which the prophet had called the greater jihad, but others explicitly command the believers to slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and to fight those who do not believe in God, until they pay the tax in acknowledgement of superiority and they are in a state of subjection. Some Islamic scholars explain these injunctions by saying that they apply only when war is initiated by the infidels, or when Muslims are persecuted, or when Islam itself is threatened. The Quran, these thinkers point out, also bids the Muslims to fight in the way of God against those who fight against you. And be not aggressive. Surely God loves not the aggressors. Under the spell of the Afghan struggle, many radical Islamists came to believe that jihad never ends. For them, the war against the Soviet occupation was only a skirmish in an eternal war. They called themselves jihadis, indicating the centrality of war to their religious understanding. They were the natural outgrowth of the Islamist exaltation of death over life. He who dies and has not fought and was not resolved to fight has died a Jahiliyyah death. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers, had declared, He who dies and has not fought and was not resolved to fight has died a Jahiliyyah death. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers, had declared. He added, with a bit of residual Sufi mysticism, death is art. The Quran explicitly states that there is no compulsion in religion. That would seem to forbid waging war against non-Muslims and against Muslims who believe differently. Sayyid Qutb, however, scorned the notion that jihad is just a defensive maneuver to protect the community of faith. Islam is not merely belief, he wrote. Islam is a declaration of the Islam is the declaration of the freedom of man from servitude to other men. Thus, it strives from the beginning to abolish all those systems and governments which are based on the rule of man over men. Qutb makes the argument that life without Islam is slavery. Therefore, real freedom cannot be achieved until Jahiliyyah is eliminated. It is only when the rule of man has been eradicated and Sharia imposed that there will be no compulsion in religion, because there is only one choice, Islam. Yet the declaration of jihad was tearing the Muslim community apart. There was never a consensus that the jihad in Afghanistan was a genuine religious obligation. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, the local chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood refuted the demand to send its members to jihad, although it encouraged relief work in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those who did go were often unaffiliated with established Muslim organizations, and therefore more open to radicalization. Many concerned Saudi fathers went to the training camps to drag their sons home. The fierce idealists who did respond to Azam's message viewed Afghanistan as the beginning of Islam's return to international dominance, which would see not only the liberation of the Afghans, but also the eventual recapture of all the territory from Spain to China that had been under enlightened Muslim domination while Europe was mired in the Middle Ages. The restoration of the former empire was only the first step, however. The next stage was final war against unbelievers, culminating in the Day of Judgment. The Arab Afghans were not all suicidal or apocalyptic thinkers. They included as well the curious, the holiday fighters, the students looking for an exciting way to spend their break. Others were seeking significance that their ordinary lives didn't provide. I was not a believer, Mohammed Loaib Baizid, a Syrian immigrant to the United States, remembered. 24 years old in 1985, he thought of himself as a typical young, middle-class American man, used to shopping malls and fast food, but he had run across a mimeographed tract by Abdullah Azam and decided that if there were miracles, he would have to see them. He was studying engineering at a community college in Kansas City, Missouri at the time. No one could tell him how to get to the war from Kansas City, so he took a plane to Islamabad and called the number on the tract. If Azam had not answered, he didn't know what he would have done. Baizid had only planned to stay for 3 months, but he was captivated by the strangeness of the place and the camaraderie of men who courted martyrdom. His expressive black eyebrows and constant stream of wisecracks were strikingly out of place in this sober group of holy warriors. I went to Afghanistan with a blank mind and a good heart, he said. Everything was totally strange. It was like I was born just now, like I was an infant, and I have to learn everything new. It was not easy after that to leave and go back to your regular life. He took the jihadi name Abu Rida Asuri. Untrained but eager for action, the brigade of strangers agitated until Azam agreed to take them to Afghanistan to join forces with the Afghan commander Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was fighting the Soviets near Jihad Wall. Bin Laden and 60 Arabs rode across the border with a single Afghan guide. Thinking that they were headed directly into battle, they had stuffed their pockets with raisins and chickpeas, most of which they consumed during the long drive. They began referring to themselves as the Brigade of the Chickpeas. Around 10 that night, they finally arrived at the Afghan camp, only to learn that the Soviets had retreated. Your presence is no longer needed, Hekmatyar impatiently told them the following morning. So go back. Azam immediately consented, but Bin Laden and some of the other Arabs expressed their dismay. If they have withdrawn, aren't we supposed to at least chase them? They asked. Azam set up some targets on fence posts so the men could have some shooting practice. Afterward, the Arabs surrendered their weapons to an Afghan commander and caught buses back to Peshawar. They began calling themselves the Brigade of the Ridiculous. When they got back to the city, they disbanded. In 1986, Bin Laden brought his wives and children into Peshawar. where they joined the small but growing community of Arabs responding to Sheikh Abdullah Azam's fatwa. It was clear by then that the Afghans were winning the war. Admitting that Afghanistan was a bleeding wound, Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, offered a timetable for the complete withdrawal of Soviet troops. That was also the year that the American-made Stinger, the hand-fired missile that proved so deadly for Russian aircraft, was introduced, decisively tipping the battle in favor of the Mujahideen. Although it would take another 3 bloody years for the Soviets to finally extricate themselves, the presence of several thousand Arabs, and rarely more than a few hundred of them actually on the field of battle, made no real difference in the tide of affairs. Arms shipments poured into port of Karachi. The ISI, which divvied the weapons among the Afghan commanders, needed a repository, preferably outside of Pakistan, but not within the grasps of the Soviets. There's a distinctive portion of the tribal areas that juts into Afghanistan along a range of mountains southwest of the Khyber Pass known as the Parrot's Beak. The northern slope of the Parrot's Beak is called Tora Bora. The name means black dust. Remote and barren, the place is rich in caves made of super hard quartz and feldspar. Bin Laden expanded the caverns and constructed new ones to serve as armories. It was here, in the warren of ammunition caves that he built for the Mujahideen, that bin Laden would one day make his stand against America. In May 1986, bin Laden led a small group of Arabs to join Afghan forces in Jaji, in Sayyaf's territory near the Pakistan border. One night, the Arab tents were pelted with what seemed to be rocks, perhaps debris thrown from the occasional distant bombs. When a Yemeni cook got up to prepare the pre-dawn meal, there was a huge explosion. "God is great! God is great!" the cook cried out. "My leg! My leg!" The Arabs awakened to find mines strewn around their encampment, although they were difficult to see because they were green and disappeared in the grass. As they were excavating the site, a guided missile struck a few yards from bin Laden. As they were evacuating the site, a guided missile struck a few yards from bin Laden. Then a huge explosion on the mountaintop spewed boulders and splintered wood upon the besieged Arabs. 3 were wounded, and 1, an Egyptian graduate student, was killed. The Arabs were thrown into panic, and they were further humiliated when the Afghan forces asked them to leave because they were so useless. Despite this sorry display, bin Laden financed the first permanent all-Arab camp at the end of 1986, also at Jaji. This action put him at odds with his mentor Azam, who strongly opposed the plan. Each man was beset by a powerful and impractical dream. Azam longed to erase the national divisions that kept the Muslim people from uniting. For that reason, he always sought to disperse the Arab volunteers among the various Afghan commands. Even though few Arabs spoke the local languages or had received any practical training, they were cannon fodder. On the other hand, a fixed target such as the camp bin Laden envisioned was an extravagant waste of money and lives in the hit-and-run guerrilla warfare that the Afghans were waging. Bin Laden was already thinking of the future of jihad, and the Jaji camp was his first step toward the creation of an Arab legion that could wage war anywhere. Until now, he had subordinated his dream to the goals of the older man, but he was beginning to feel the tug of destiny. Desperate to stop bin Laden's drift from his orbit, Azam dispatched Jamal Khalifa to reason with him. No one could speak more frankly or with more authority to bin Laden than his old friend and brother-in-law. Khalifa rode across the Afghan border with Sayyaf, who controlled the mountainous territory around Jaji. The camp was high and cold and exposed to merciless wind. Osama the Lion called the place Masada, the lion's den, He said he had been inspired by the lines of the Prophet's favorite poet, Hassan ibn Thabit, who wrote of another fortress of the same name. Whoever wishes to hear the clash of swords, let him come to Masada. Masada. Whoever wishes to hear the clash of the swords, let him come to Masada, where he will find courageous men ready to die for the sake of God. At the time, bin Laden's version of Masada looked nothing like the elaborate, cavernous training center it eventually became. Khalifa had been a devoted Boy Scout, and in his experienced eye, this filthy and disorganized site, hidden in the pine trees, was far below even the standards of a children's encampment. There was a bulldozer, Egyptian knockoffs of Kalashnikovs, mortars, some small anti-aircraft guns they had bought in the markets in Peshawar, and Chinese rockets without launchers. To fire a rocket, the mujahid would rest it on a rock, string a wire, and set it off from a distance away. A crazily dangerous and inaccurate procedure. Through binoculars, Khalifa surveyed the Soviet base in a broad valley only 3 kilometers away. The Arabs were isolated and vulnerable. They had a single car that they used to smuggle water and supplies during the night, but they could easily be trapped and wiped out. They were already being carelessly expended under bin Laden's command. Khalifa was furious at the needless risk and the waste of lives. He stayed for 3 days, talking to the people around bin Laden, mainly Egyptians associated with Zawahiri's al-Jihad and Saudi high school students, including Khalifa's own student, Wali Khan, an academic star in the biology class he taught in Medina. Khalifa learned that they had appointed bin Laden rather than Azam or Sayyaf, their leader. That news stunned him. He had never thought of his friend as one who would seek power. Khalifa wondered if Osama was being manipulated by Egyptians. These suspicions mounted when Abu Ubaidah and Abu Hafs, bin Laden's tall and commanding Egyptian tenders, cornered Khalifa to sound him out about his politics. They started talking about how the leaders of the Arab countries are kafirs, a term that means infidels or unbelievers, but when applied to other Muslims signifies that they are apostates who have rejected their religion. Such traitors should be killed, many fundamentalists believe. When Khalifa disagreed with them, they tried to screen him off from bin Laden. Khalifa brushed past them. He would not be managed by strangers. Khalifa and bin Laden slept together in a foxhole with canvas sides and a wood ceiling, which had soil piled on top. His friend was so evasive that Khalifa decided he was hiding something from him. On the 3rd day, Khalifa finally spoke out. "Everybody is angry. They are against this place," Khalifa said. "Even the people who are with you. I've talked to them." Bin Laden was shocked. "Why don't they talk to me?" he asked. "This is a question you have to ask yourself," Khalifa responded. "But everyone in Afghanistan is against this idea." Bin Laden reiterated his vision of creating an Arab force that would defend Muslim causes everywhere. That's what he was trying to establish in this miserable mountaintop. "We came here to help the Afghans, not to form our own party," Khalifa reminded him. "Besides, you're not a military man, so why are you here?" As they talked, their voices began to rise. In the 10 years they had known each other, they had never had an argument. "This is jihad," bin Laden cried. "This is the way we want to go to heaven." Khalifa warned him that the lives of these men were his responsibility. "God will ask you about every drop of their blood, and since I am your friend, I cannot accept that you stay. You have to leave, or else I will leave you." Bin Laden coldly refused. Khalifa left the camp. They would never be close again. Although he rejected the entreaties of Khalifa and others, bin Laden was concerned about the repeated failures of the Arab Brigade and the dangers his men faced in the lion's den. I began thinking about new strategies such as digging caves and tunnels, he said. He borrowed an array of bulldozers, loaders, dump trucks, and trenching machines from the Saudi bin Laden group, along with skilled engineers to craft 7 man-made caverns well disguised and perched above the main supply line from Pakistan. Some of the caves would be more than 100 yards long and 20 feet high, serving as air raid shelters, dormitories, hospitals, and arms dumps. Bin Laden's men were impatient with construction work and continually pestered him for new opportunities to attack the Russians. The most vehement among them was an obese 45-year-old Palestinian, Sheikh Tamim al-Adnani, a former English teacher who had become the imam of the Air Force base in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, until he was expelled because of his radical views. A pale, fleshy man with a patchy fringe of beard that was turning gray at the temples, Sheikh Tamim turned to the lecture circuit, raising millions of dollars for the Mujahideen. His scholarship and worldliness, plus his ardent longing for martyrdom, gave him an authority that rivaled that of bin Laden. Abdullah Azam, who doted on him, called him the Lofty Mountain. Sheikh Tamim weighed nearly 400 pounds. His corpulence was a source of amusement to the young Arab fighters, most of whom were not over 18 years old. They would sometimes have to tow him up the steep mountain paths with ropes, joking that the horses had memorized his face and refused to carry him any longer. But Sheikh Tamim's commitment to jihad inspired him. He trained with the others despite his age and his poor physical condition. He was constantly pushing bin Laden to throw men into battle, giving voice to the bold and heedless elements in the camp who were lusting for death. Bin Laden managed to put him off, citing the men's lack of training and the pressing need to finish construction, but Tamim never let up. At the end of March 1987, bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, and Sheikh Tamim took advantage of the moment. He cajoled Abu Hajar al-Iraqi, whom bin Laden had left in charge of the Lion's Den, to attack a small Soviet outpost nearby. Abu Hajar protested that he didn't have the authority to make such a decision, but Sheikh Tamim's persistence wore him down, and Abu Hajar reluctantly gave his assent. The sheikh quickly assembled 14 to 16 young men who piled their heavy weapons onto a horse and began trekking down the mountain. The weapons kept sliding off the horse's back into the snow. Tamim had no plan other than to attack the Soviets and immediately retreat, nor was he entirely sure where he was going. If the Arabs actually engaged in a firefight with the enemy, Sheikh Tamim would be unable to run back up the mountain with the lithe young fighters who accompanied him. But as usual, caution was not a feature of his scheme. Suddenly, Abu Hajar's voice cracked on the walkie-talkie. Bin Laden had returned and he was alarmed. He ordered the men back to camp immediately. "Tell him that I will not return," Sheikh Tamim responded. Bin Laden took the radio. "Sheikh Tamim, return at once," he commanded. "If you do not, you will be sinful, for I am your commander and I am ordering you to return." Tamim grudgingly agreed to give up his battle plan, but he swore that he would fast until he had the opportunity to participate in battle. For 3 days after his return to the Lion's Den, he refused to eat or drink. He became so weak that bin Laden finally arranged for a small action so that Tamim could fulfill his pledge, at least symbolically. He allowed the sheikh to climb a peak and fire mortars and machine guns toward the enemy. But Sheikh Tamim continued to present a challenge to bin Laden's authority, since many of the Arabs sided with him, saying that they had come for jihad, not for camping in the mountains. "I was afraid that some of the brothers might return to their countries and tell their people that they had stayed for 6 months without ever shooting a single gun," bin Laden admitted. "People might conclude that we don't need their support." He had to prove that the Arabs were not just tourists, that they were capable of making a genuine contribution to the Afghan jihad. It was unclear how long he could keep men under his command if he failed to let them fight. On April 17, 1987, before the snows had melted, bin Laden led a force of 120 fighters to harass an Afghan government outpost near Khost. He chose to attack on a Friday because he believed Muslims all over the world would be praying for the Mujahideen. Both Sayyaf, the Arab-speaking Afghan commander, and Hekmatyar agreed to provide covering artillery fire. The attack was set for 6 o'clock in the evening, time enough for a quick strike followed by a darkness that would protect the men from the Soviet aircraft that would soon be raining bombs upon them. Sheikh Tamim begged to be a part of the action, but bin Laden ordered him to remain in the lion's den. The impending battle was months in the planning and had been well advertised back in Peshawar. I heard about this attack and decided to join, Abu Rida, the Kansas City Mujahid, later recalled. I took my car. I didn't know much about the plan, but I found so many donkeys and horses carrying weapons. I took my car. I didn't know much about the plan, but I found so many donkeys and horses carrying weapons in the valley. When he arrived at the staging area, he discovered chaos among the Arabs. At the time of the scheduled attack, none of the positions had been supplied with ammunition, which was stuck in a car at the end of the road some distance away. The men were frantically transporting rockets and mortars on their backs or on 4 mules they had available. Some fighters were already so exhausted they had slipped back to the lion's den to sleep. And those who stayed were famished and upset because the food had run out. At the last minute, one of the commanders discovered that no one had brought the electrical wire to connect the rockets to the detonators. He dispatched a man on a horse to gallop back to the camp. On top of this, bin Laden was ill, as he often was before battle, although he tried to remain composed in front of his men. Sheikh Abdullah Azam gave a rousing speech about the need to stand firm, but before the Arabs were ready to charge, an Afghan government soldier overheard their preparations and single-handedly kept them pinned down until nightfall with a Gorjanov machine gun. Bin Laden ordered his troops to withdraw. Amazingly, only 1 Arab was killed and 2 badly injured, but their pride was shattered. They had been defeated by 1 man. The Afghan Mujahideen were laughing at them. As a result of this fiasco, the Pakistanis began closing down the Arab guest houses in Peshawar. It seemed that the Arab-Afghan misadventure had come to an ignominious finale. The following month, a small band of Arabs engaged in another skirmish, this one planned by their Egyptian military commander, Abu Ubaidah, who led a flanking maneuver against a group of Soviet troops. There were 9 of them and myself, bin Laden later recounted. No one hesitated. The Soviets fell back and the Arabs were jubilant. But their brief victory prompted a stern Soviet counterattack against the lion's den. According to Abdullah Azam's myth-making account, the Soviets assembled 9 or 10,000 troops, including Soviet special forces and Afghan regulars, against only 70 Mujahideen. Sheikh Tamim pleaded with bin Laden to place him on the front lines, but bin Laden told him he was too fat for active fighting. He consigned Tamim to the communications room deep in an underground chamber. The Arabs waited until the entire Soviet convoy was within range of their 3 mortars. When bin Laden cried, Allahu Akbar, the Arabs opened fire, and the surprised Russians fell back. The brothers were in a state of elation and total ecstasy, Azam wrote. They watched ambulances arriving to collect the fallen soldiers, who included the military commander of the Jaji district. Expecting another large Soviet attack, bin Laden divided his force in half, stationing 35 men to guard the lion's den. He and 9 others advanced to the top of a hill, where they observed 200 Russian special forces creeping toward the camp. Suddenly, mortar rounds began to pour on us like rain, said bin Laden. Miraculously, the Arabs escaped harm. An hour later, the Russians confidently resumed their advance. When they reached the peak, we began our attack, bin Laden continued. A few of them were killed, and the rest fled. For weeks, the Soviets shelled the Mujahideen position around the lion's den with 120mm mortars and napalm bombs. which caused such devastation that Azam wept and prayed for the safety of the fighters. The trees burned, even in the rain, illuminating the night. One morning, in this storm of shrapnel and fire, Sheikh Tamim emerged from the communications cave with his Quran in hand and began to wander into the clearing, ignoring the pleas of his comrades as he recited the Quran and prayed aloud for martyrdom. His round, wire-rimmed glasses tilted toward the sky. The ground shook, and bullets and explosions tore the forest around him. It was near the end of Ramadan, and Tamim believed that his death on such an occasion would be especially blessed. This mad excursion seemed to have a calming effect on others. We came under fire quickly, bin Laden recalled. When the fire stopped for about 30 seconds, I told the people I was with that I thought we were going to die. But within minutes, the fire started again, and I was reading the Holy Quran until we were saved, and we were able to move to a different location. We hadn't moved 70 meters when we were hit again, and we felt completely safe, as if we were in an air-conditioned room. Despite the bravado, bin Laden worried that his men would all be killed if they stayed any longer. He would have to abandon the lion's den. It was the worst defeat he had ever suffered. His men were shocked at the decision. When one of them protested, bin Laden shouted at me and told me some words which I heard for the first time from him. Sheikh Tamim bellowed and pulled the hair from his beard. I thought he was possessed, recalled bin Laden. He scolded Tamim, saying that he was endangering all the fighters by his intransigence. Sheikh Tamim, the men are in the car, bin Laden warned him. If a single one of them is killed, the sin will fall on your neck and you will be responsible for his blood on Judgment Day. Sobbing, Sheikh Tamim joined the other men in the van. Those who were able to walk followed behind, after destroying much of the lion's den, so that there would be nothing for the Soviets to pillage. They rolled their cannons into the ravines and buried their automatic weapons. Some of them threw a grenade into the pantry. The camp that they had labored so mightily to construct was now a ruin. A small squad stayed behind to provide cover for the retreating guerrillas. Once again, bin Laden was ill. I was very tired and could barely walk 20 meters before I had to stop and drink water. I had been under great emotional and physical duress. His ordeal had only just begun. Saif was fuming when the bedraggled Arabs reached his camp. By now, he had come to see the value of the lion's den, which overlooked a strategic caravan route for the supply of the Mujahideen. He abruptly countermanded bin Laden's order and told the Arabs to return. He also sent some of his reliable Afghan warriors back to camp, and with them, to make sure that they held the position. Embarrassed and exhausted, the fighters returned to the lion's den in groups of 5 or 10. Dawn found 25 Arabs and 20 Afghans gathered in the ruins of the camp, dismally celebrating the feast at the end of Ramadan. There was practically nothing to eat since the kitchen had been blown up. Each man received 3 lemons. Later in the morning, bin Laden returned with 10 more fighters. Chastened and unwilling to assert his authority, he let his Egyptian military commander, Abu Ubaidah, take charge. The sight of the needless destruction of his camp at his own hand must have been unbearable. Abu Ubaidah decided to give him something to do. Go and guard the left side of the camp, Abu Ubaidah told him. I think they will only enter from this place because it's the shortest path. Bin Laden led the men to a promontory. And spread them out among the trees. They could see a Russian force only 70 meters away. Bin Laden called out to his men to advance, but his voice was hoarse, and they didn't realize he was talking to them. He climbed a leafless tree so that they could hear him and immediately drew fire. A rocket-propelled grenade nearly knocked him out of the tree. It passed by me and exploded nearby, bin Laden said in one account, but I was not affected by it at all. In fact, by the grace of Allah, the Exalted, it was as though I had merely been covered by a handful of mud from the ground. I descended calmly and informed the brothers that the enemy was in the central axis and not on the left wing. In another retelling, bin Laden's most intense experience of combat seems less composed. There was a terrible battle which ended up with me half sunk in the ground, firing at anything I could see. Bin Laden and his men were pinned down all day by enemy mortar fire. I was only 30 meters from the Russians, and they were trying to capture me, he said. I was under bombardment, but I was so peaceful in my heart that I fell asleep. The story of bin Laden's nap is often told as evidence of his grace under fire. He may simply have fainted. He suffered from low blood pressure, which often made him lightheaded. He always carried a bag of salt with him, and whenever he felt dizzy, he would wet a finger and stick it in the bag, then suck on the salt to keep his blood pressure from sinking. Amazingly, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Arab forces, led by Abu Ubaidah, succeeded in outflanking the enemy. Without air support, the main body of the Soviet troops withdrew. There were only 9 brothers against 100 Russian Spetsnaz special forces troops, but out of sheer fright and panic in the dense forest, the Russians were unable to make out the number of brothers, bin Laden related. All in all, about 35 Spetsnaz and officers were killed, and the rest fled. The morale of the Mujahideen soared, not only in our area, but in the whole of Afghanistan. He had achieved his greatest victory immediately following his worst defeat. After the Battle of the Lion's Den, Abu Ubaidah gave bin Laden a trophy from a dead Russian officer, a small Kalashnikov AK-74 assault rifle with a walnut stock and distinctive rusty red ammunition magazine that marked it as the advanced paratroop version of the weapon. In the future, it would always be on his shoulder. The entire action lasted 3 weeks. It was actually waged more by Sayyaf, who took over the Lion's Den, than bin Laden, but the Arabs gained a reputation for courage and recklessness that established their legend, at least among themselves. Their guest houses quietly reopened in Peshawar. From the Soviet perspective, the Battle of the Lion's Den was a small moment in the tactical retreat from Afghanistan. In the heightened religious atmosphere among the men following bin Laden, however, there was a dizzying sense that they were living in a supernatural world in which reality knelt before faith. For them, the encounter at the Lion's Den became the foundation of the myth that they defeated the superpower. Within a few years, the entire Soviet empire fell to pieces, dead of the wound the Muslims inflicted in Afghanistan, the jihadis believe. By then, they had created the vanguard that was to carry the battle forward. Al-Qaeda was conceived in the marriage of these assumptions. Faith is stronger than weapons or nations, and the ticket to enter the sacred zone where such miracles occur is the willingness to die. End of chapter.